All right, welcome back here to the Gill Athletics Connections Podcast, episode number 203. This is quite a joy for me. Anytime we have a coach here on the podcast, it's just fascinating to me. I just love learning their journey, their reasons for getting into coaching, and it's always maybe just a little bit more special when I have an actual personal connection with the guest, and that's what we have today. This is actually one of my mentors. When I coached, someone that I looked up to, he was a combined events coach, teacher for me in level 2, and I just learned so much about how to coach and not just the X's and O's, but how to be a coach, how to think about being a coach. So I'm super excited to bring you today's guest. Help me welcome comes to the University of Kansas State. That's terrible. Kansas State University, the head coach of the Wildcats there. Help me welcome the wise, the wonderful, Mr. Cliff Rovelto. Cliff, how are you, sir?
Great, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you. I know how busy you are. And one of the topics we'll probably get into is, that you're a track coach, not a jumps coach or a sprints coach. So you are always busy with practice. So I'm just so thankful that you were able to carve out some time for us today.
You bet. It's my pleasure.
Awesome, man. So Cliff, I love you to death. It's something I can easily publicly say. You were someone who, when I was coaching, not only did I look up to because of the success you had, but also because of I'm going to call it your steadiness. Like it feels like you don't get too high and you don't get too low. And whether you're talking to a discus thrower, a pole vaulter, a 100-meter sprinter, it's always about, well, what do we need to take care of and achieve the success that we can today. So I've always looked up to you, really got to know you during that combined events down in Mississippi State when you were teaching me there, and just have enjoyed all of our conversations. So this is a real thrill to kind of dig deep into how you got into coaching and your path along the way.
Well, thanks. I enjoy visiting about our profession. I think highly of it, and I think highly of the people that are a part of our sport. And so I love to share the time with you.
Amen. That's exactly right. That's why we started. Uplift and honor the coaches from all levels here around the world, really, but obviously we focus here domestically. So excited to jump into it. See, that was a good pun. Actually excited to jump into it here. No more puns, I promise. So Cliff, assuming that you are an athlete, you tell us, somewhere coaching had to change for you, like maybe like a light switch had to change, that it went from something that was done to you, go run this, go jump that, go lift this, to something where in your head you had to have changed and say, well, wait a minute, like I could actually be like maybe that could be my career one day. Where does coaching begin for you as a profession?
Well, my entry into track and field is quite a bit different probably than what most were. I actually never competed in track and field at any level ever.
Ever.
Ever. I did pretty much every team sport there was. And I started golf when I was probably around 12 years old or something like that. And I was just a very average, high school athlete. Probably the only thing I really ever got to be decent at was golf. I at one point had to play to about a 2 handicap.
Oh, wow.
But in other sports, I was just an average guy. And as I said, I never competed in track and field. I did run cross country a couple of years after I had to stop playing football in high school. And the basketball coach, I actually went to 5 different schools from 9th grade on.
So, oh, wow.
I was a military brat, and my dad served 2 tours of Vietnam during that time frame, and we just kept moving. And so obviously that's kind of a disadvantage in the team sports, but again, I was just an average athlete, so I don't feel badly about that at all. It was what it was. It was a great experience, but anyway, when I stopped playing football, I always loved basketball. It's still probably today my favorite sport. And the basketball coaches wanted me involved in something, and they said, go out and train with the cross country team. Right. And I ended up just running just well enough to make the varsity. And so I did run a couple of years of cross country in high school, but never competed in track and field. And so when I went to school as an undergrad at University of Kansas, and was an education major, with history, government kind of minor. Always intended to go to law school, to be honest.
Oh, wow.
I did a practicum in coaching. Well, even before that, I started when Coach Timmons was the head coach at the University of Kansas. I was worked as a part of the student relays organizational committee, if you will.
Uh-huh.
And so back then, you had to do all the flights and heats by time, and it was a huge, or excuse me, not by time, by hand. And
Right.
it was a 2-week process to put on that track meet. For us, for Coach Timmons, it was a year-round endeavor. But for us, it was 2-3 weeks of every day, all night, getting prepared for that meet. Anyway, I served on that relays committee, so that was really my first exposure to track and field. I fell in love with Coach Timmons. He's just such a wonderful human being and a wonderful coach, and really enjoyed working with that committee. And then got to know some of the other coaches. Coach Pepin, was an assistant coach at Kansas at that time, and Stan Naruski, and they're just
Wow.
a lot of great guys in the sport. And so that was my first exposure. And then I did when it came time to do a practicum in coaching, at that point, everybody would always go to, a local high school or junior high or something like that. And, because of getting to know the track coaches at KU a little bit, I asked, my advisor, was it possible that I do that with the track team? And they said, well, nobody's ever asked before. I don't know. You need to go talk to the coaches. And so I went to Coach Timmons and asked if it was possible. And he said, sure, absolutely. And so I kind of shadowed, if you will, for a semester, Stan Naruski, who was one of the assistants at that time, who worked with the sprint hurdle group. And so that was all my first exposure to the sport. That's kind of how I got into it.
Well, I got to give a shout out. Stan Naruski's a good friend of mine. When I first got into coaching on the collegiate level, he was one of the first people I met as well down in Alabama, and was also always just one of the nicest, just greatest people that I ever met. So I love that you had experience with Stan at such an early age. I'm curious, go back. There's something you and I have in common, but opposite. You mentioned you went to 5 different high schools during your high school time. Now, I did similar, except for I went to the same high school all 4 years, but before that, so K through 8, I was adding it up once, and I got to about 20 different schools. I always moved every year, a lot of times twice a year, or I'm sorry, once a year in between. And then sometimes twice. I'd have 3 schools, not from a little bit because of military, some of that, but just not good home, back and forth to different places and stuff like that. And I know how it affected me. I'm curious, how did that affect you? You're always the new guy. You mentioned how that's not a great advantage for team sports, right? Because you always have to prove yourself in that position. It's not like, well, man, they know me what I did last year. Maybe I'll play some more this year. You're starting from scratch every year. How did that affect you when you look back now at this age and stage of your life? How did that affect you positively or negatively?
Well, just in general, growing up, I from basically kindergarten on, I was never in the same school more than a year and a half.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, I was just naive to it all. I just thought, well, this is how it is with everybody. It was around military kids, and this is what everybody does. So I never really thought of it as being as odd as it is at the time. Just because of the life of a military officer, is just what it is. But I didn't have as much trouble with it. I don't, for whatever reason. I have a younger brother and 2 younger sisters, and it seemed to affect them a little bit more. But for some reason, it didn't affect me as much. I guess I just adapted and went on, and I really, like I said, I fell in love with sport, which was kind of my father, my mother, neither one of them had any interest in sport at all. Never. And so I was just kind of different than everybody else in my family. And
well, that rings true to today for you, Cliff. You're just different.
exactly. So I can't say it was a negative thing in my life.
Yeah.
In fact, I think it probably was a positive thing because it just forced me to be, more adaptable.
Yeah, that's what I would say. There's negativity in the sense of like, well, you don't get deep friendships. You make a best friend and you're gone. And this is including with me. This was before internet day, so it's not like, oh, well, we stayed in touch over Facebook or text messaging. It's like, yeah, no, you were just gone
Right.
at that point. So I think there was a lot of positivity though, in the sense of like, oh, okay, I walked in every year not knowing the other 20 children. I had to figure out where was my niche, who was I going to be friends with, who was not the good kids, etc. And you just had to repeat that every single time. So I thought there was some positivity to it, even though I wasn't as, like, my wife thinks that my kind of outgoing extrovertedness is because of that. And I was like, well, I certainly was not this way back then. I was more of a shy kid and was not cool and popular. But you just learn, to your point, I think adaptability, I think, is the right term there. Yeah. So you go to college, and you go to college though, like, you're going to be a lawyer. Like, this is, you mentioned education and history. So you're maybe kind of a teaching background. Were parents teachers, or what was the motive for that?
No, as I said, my dad was a military officer, artillery officer, and my mother, was always a stay-at-home mom. So, she didn't work. So there was no teaching background. I started off, actually, I was going to major in political science, and that's pretty much what I took for the first year and a half or so of college. And then I began to realize that, well, if this law school thing doesn't work out, what am I going to do with a political science degree? And so that's when I switched over to education, and I had such an interest in history and government and that type of thing. And so that's actually what I taught in high school. Yeah, I don't know. I was just ever, like all of us, I think, at that age, you're just ever evolving. What I thought I wanted to do. I mean, I still have an interest in the law to this day. I love reading and so forth in that area, but I just fell in love with coaching. When I left KU, I coached at a small 2A high school in Kansas for a couple of years, and I was very fortunate to have, some wonderful athletes to work with. Some of them, went on to be tremendously successful as athletes and coaches themselves. Worked with, Coach Tom Hayes in high school, who coaches the, vertical
Really?
at KU now. Yeah, I coached Tom his junior and senior year in high school. We had a guy named Ron McHenry, who was a phenomenal basketball player, that, was a part of a Division II national championship team at Washburn, and won a national championship on the women's side when he was coaching women's basketball at Washburn. Just retired from coaching a couple of years ago. So I had some really wonderful kids, and I think that had a lot to do with me falling in love with the sport, because of having the opportunity to work with, really fine people, not just fine athletes, but fine people like that, at a very young age. And so I just fell in love with the sport.
So as you were taking that practicum and then you were shadowing with Nabruski and Timmons, how was your mindset? Like, did you know at that point you wanted to be a coach? So were you paying extra attention to how they structured practices and things like that? Or was it still like, I just love the sports, I'm just learning?
It was really more, I fell in love with the sport, the kind of people that were involved in the sport, the uniqueness of the sport, and that you have so many different disciplines. I really enjoyed all of that. But no, to be perfectly honest, in terms of, how to coach the pole vault or hurdler or whatever, I really wasn't into it like that at that point in time. I was really more involved in, like you said, I was always kind of involved in the meet administration stuff there as an undergrad. And then and just the organization of the sport and kind of bigger picture issues, if you will, involving, collegiate athletics in general, and more specifically, cross country and track and field. Coach Timmons was, very, just a special coach. Truly one of the all-time greats, not just because of the successes he had, and obviously they had a lot of that, with their men's program in the 20 years that he was there. But the impression he left on me, he was just so concerned with the bigger picture. He was so concerned with the sport in general and in its place in collegiate athletics. And he was involved with Cliff Wiley, with the case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, in which kids were it was ruled that kids could keep their Pell Grant on top of their scholarship. That was he was a part of all of that. And he was working on a athlete's Bill of Rights in the 70s.
Wow.
And literally had, it's hard to explain. I bet when he was done, he had probably 50 cartons full of articles that he had cut out over the years, that were describing issues that the student athletes had to deal with. And many of those things, little by little, have been dealt with over the years. And some of it was, what was really amazing is some of the solutions that he had for some of the so-called problems that we're dealing with today were literally, scores of years ahead of time. Because at the time, we'd have these discussions, and I said, Coach, I just don't know how that would work. And now you look at it today and you're like, well, it would work really well if we were doing that. And so anyway, I think, being around someone like that early on, really got me more concerned with, the bigger issues in sport and in our sport, more specifically. But that was because of Coach Timmons.
Tell us, so for us that don't know, I know Coach Timmons by name, obviously the track meet and, and the history, but never met him or even really know maybe necessarily a lot of stories about him. How do you, so this was a big early influence on your specifically track coaching as you go into coaching track and field. What else? You gave some great examples there. What else by style or how he treated, he must have been a very athlete focused coach, because he's talking about things. He wasn't a squasher coach of like, no, you guys just shut up and run. Seemed like he was the Bill of Rights for athletes, things like that. He was very progressive. Interesting that we think these issues that we're dealing with today are very new. They're in the last 10 to 15 to 20 years. And it's like, no, we've been battling this for quite a long time. And we're just now catching up to 40, 50 years ago.
Right.
What influence does he have over your style? You mentioned you still like law. Are you currently drafting another track and field Bill of Rights for athletes, or how does that affect you today?
Well, in terms of his influence, one, extremely hardworking. And I was fortunate to be around a few coaches that were, as a high school athlete, and when I was, doing the things I was doing as an undergrad at the University of Kansas, I was just around phenomenal coaches, people that had unbelievable work ethics. Bob Timmons, Gary Pepin, people like that. But I think one of the things that struck me with Coach Timmons is just how much he truly cared about the sport and what was best for the sport, and how much he cared about, kids, not just as athletes, but as people. He truly cared. And, you mentioned you didn't know much about his background. I think, he coached, I believe, for like 20 years at KU. And so in 40 indoor outdoor championships, I think they won 38, in the time that he was there, and they were perennially a top 10 NCAA type of a team. It was just tremendously successful. And a lot of that was, because of the phenomenal staffs that he had, when he was there. But for all that success, like I said, he was just as competitive and motivated to do well as anybody. But all these other issues were just as, if not more important to him.
Wow.
And that really had a huge impression on me, that it was, that coaching and working with kids is more about jumping high and scoring a lot of points. It's, and I think that, I can't imagine, I'm sure there are other people that I would have had just as profound influence, but it's hard to imagine anyone that could be more influential in terms of, giving you pause and thinking about things the right way, if you will, at least the way I think is the right way to think about sport.
And, I mentioned this earlier, I think of you as a very all around, a track coach, not a sprints coach, jumps coach. And obviously there's certain events you get pegged more, the high jump or combined events, etc. Did you learn that early on from like Bob and the staff, or were they like, did that have to evolve for you? Like, did you start out as like, well, I'm a sprint coach or I'm a jumps coach?
No, one of the things that I observed early on is that, so Coach Timmons, for example, he was Jim Ryan's coach, in high school and at KU, and I think he coached, I don't know, 3 or 4 guys that had national high school records in the mile and, a bunch of relays but he started, what a lot of people don't realize is he started off as a swim coach. And he actually coached more national champions and more national record holders in high school in swimming than he did in track and field.
Really?
So here's a guy who had, quite a background. And he himself, Coach Timmons is about 5'4", 5'5", and he was a hurdler in high school.
Awesome.
So so the examples I saw, and Stan Naruski, a lot of the Coach Pepin, a lot of these folks were very, very knowledgeable about all aspects of the sport, and so that certainly had an influence on me. But when I coached at high school, as I said, it was a very small school, and I was, basically the only coach. We had a gal that helped us that, had no background in the sport or coaching or anything. And, wonderful person and a great help, but I was forced to learn all of the events. And I really think that was probably, I think the 2 years that I spent coaching at McLeod High School was probably, the best thing that ever happened to me. Because we didn't have a track. The first year we were there, we didn't have a pole vault pit. We had to drive to other communities to be able to vault. We had to be very creative. And so I had to, I was just forced to learn as much as I could about the sport in a very short period of time. And it was, I think it was probably the greatest thing that I was ever involved with. And I've always encouraged, when we have athletes or students that are interested in going into coaching, and they say, oftentimes they just want to, be at a powerhouse Division I school, and I always talk to them about, probably the best learning experiences I had was an undergrad practicum at KU, the 2 years I spent coaching at a small high school, and then the 2 years I worked as a grad assistant, on the men's side at KU when after I, had left the high school level. That, whatever 5-6 year period of time, that's really where it all happened. There was no single moment, if you will, that I said, oh, I'm going to be a coach. I mean, It just evolved over time because of those experiences.
It's interesting you bring up the high school aspect of what it did for you now as a coach. And, there's the right or wrong perception out there of like, when a college goes to hire a coach, well, a high school coach just can't do it because they can't do recruiting or they can't do X or Y or Z. And yet, after 200 plus interviews here on the podcast, like I should actually keep stats. How many great coaches like yourself that we talked to that like, oh yeah, I started out in high school. Like a lot of coaches started on the high school level. And I love the examples you gave there of the creativity that you had to come up with. What I'm curious about, this is back in what years are this when you're at the high school?
That would have been like 79, 80, 81, right in that time.
So we could barely spell internet back in 79 and 80. Today's world, it's a lot easier. There's almost, air quotes here, no excuse not to be able to learn other events with all the YouTube, social media, access to coaches, etc. How did you, as you were forced to learn all these different events, how did that happen for you back in 79 and 80? There was no YouTube to go search, well, how do I coach hurdles?
Oh, exactly. Well, I think one of the things I've always said, one of the things that benefited me when I got involved in coaching in the sport of track and field was that I had never competed in track and field. And some people look at me kind of, what do you mean? I said, well, I didn't. And because I wasn't a great athlete and because I hadn't been a part of the sport, when I got involved in coaching, I didn't have any past experience personally. So, but I did have a lot of experience in biomechanics and exercise physiology from my studies, undergraduate studies, and then grad school was in my master's. I was working towards biomechanics. My thesis was on the pole vault. So I did have that science, if you will, background. And so I didn't have misconceptions when I guess as many perhaps as some people, like, well, this is what I ran fast and this is what I did, or I jumped high and this is what I did. So there were a lot of things that I saw being done and I saw being taught that didn't really make a lot of sense to me. So my perception of some events was right away different than what a lot of other folks, the high jump being probably the one that stands out the most. And so we approached, we just kind of evolved into approaching things a little bit differently. But during that time, I literally spent every available cent I had on books and tapes and film. And of course, back then it was, 16 millimeter and 8 millimeter. And, I spent, didn't have much money, but what I had, I spent on that. And I have accumulated quite a library over the years. And that's something that, I really worked at it. I went to every clinic I could find. I tried to speak to, other high school coaches and some of the college coaches that I got to know and just try to learn as much as I can. But I went to every clinic. I kind of consider myself to be a product of the coaching education program. I was, at the time when I was young and getting into it, and I went to the very first level 1, went to the very first level 2, taught the very first, level 2 in the combined events. And so I was just very fortunate, I guess, to come around at a time where I was kind of at the ground level of all of that. And certainly, the people that, that I had an opportunity to learn from, and then learn with, teaching with them, it was a tremendous, opportunity for me. And I'm, I'll always be appreciative of the coaching education program, because I think I benefited as much as anybody from all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And Feel that one. It's fascinating what you said there about your background of not being an athlete and how that helped, because you're able to look at things without some preconceived notions and biases. Because, I have a theory, because, the majority of our coaches were track athletes. They were coached by other track athletes. And typically when we go into coaching, we typically fall back to how we were coached, is how we at least initially start coaching. And then as we go through some coaching education, talking with peers, doing our own thinking, looking at things maybe a little differently, we kind of catch up to how we're supposed to coach, right? And so I've had this theory that as amazing as performances are happening today in 2023, which they are. I mean, it's amazing. Like, I'm so glad I got out of coaching. You guys are doing things like, I thought I knew what I was doing coaching. Now I realize, like, man, you guys were light years ahead of whatever I was trying to do out there on the track. But my theory is that because of where coaching education today is, both formal and informal. So formally with like USATF level 1s and 2s, World Athletics does coaching education, USTFCCA, Altus, I consider those formal educations. And then just as important is the informal, the peer-to-peer, things like that. I think because of how good that is today in 2023, that means our athletes are being coached better. Obviously, look at some of the results and how deep the results are. Well, when some percentage of them goes on to become coach, well, they're going to fall back to how they're coached today in 2023, which means those kids in the future are going to start at a higher level, which means their upper level should be, with a lot of things considered, genetics, et cetera, luck involved, should be even better. So I think we're at like the ground floor. We think things are crazy right now. I think in the next 10 to 15 years, it's going to get uber nuts because the floor has just been raised where we're actually starting coaching people off. So it's fascinating to me that your background of not participating in the sport helped you develop that style and maybe the non-bias of, well, I was a hurdler, so I'm a hurdles coach. That was me. I was a hurdler, so that's how my first coaching was. I'm a hurdles coach. Didn't look at the other events until forced into it, or had to for different reasons. So maybe that helped for your own lack of bias of like, well, I'm not a thing. I'm not a vaulter. I'm not a distance runner. I just know track, so I better kind of maybe figure it all out. And then of course, coaching the high school helped with that.
Right. Well, yeah, I probably a lot of my, greater successes coaching in high school was in cross country and distance running. And, as I said, we had, some fine athletes like Tom and did really well in some of the other events, but really at that time we were kind of known as a distance thing, and when I worked as a GA at KU, I worked with Roger Bowen, who worked with the vault and the sprint hurdle group. And so those were the events that I worked with, for the 2 years I was there with them. And then when Carla Coffey hired me full-time on the women's side, the programs were separate at that time. I was hired to be the cross-country coach the distance runners. Now, I did also coach the jumps and the combined events, but really, it was kind of the foremost thing was cross-country and distance. So that was really my start in coaching, was more in that area. Since I came to Kansas State, it's been everything but really the distances.
I'm going to create a coaching trivia game one day, and those are going to be the type of trivia questions like, where did Cliff Rovelto really get his start? What event? Be like, yeah, it was actually kind of cross country was his first major success there. Yeah. So a couple of years coaching high school, you decide to go back to KU to get your master's and be a GA for the program. What did you end up getting your master's in, and what was the next step? And what I mean by the next step was, the next step you were thinking was, then I'll go back to coach high school more, or was it, I'm going to go on to coach college at that point?
Yeah, well, I actually didn't finish my master's. I wrote the first 3 chapters, and I had completed all the coursework. But as I said, I got hired full time by Carla on the women's side, and I never finished it.
Yeah.
So I said, well, I got a job, so I'll just work hard at this, and I didn't mean to not finish it. I just never did.
Well, the point of education is to get a job, right? So before you even got the degree, you got that checked off. Perfect. Move on.
Exactly. So, but I really, even when I got hired, by Carla, which is my first, full-time position at the collegiate level, I didn't really have it in my mind that I was a collegiate coach or I would continue coaching at the collegiate level. It was just an opportunity at the time. And to be honest, even then I was still thinking about law school.
Oh,
So
wow.
I really don't think I was, even though my heart was in coaching, there was this other part of me that was like, well, you're supposed to go to law school and be a lawyer. And so it really wasn't until I was coaching full time, probably 3-4 years in, which is about the time that the coaching education stuff began. And it really wasn't until then where I kind of decided, well, I guess this is what I'm going to do.
Most, I'm gonna generalize here. Most parents think of their kids as they're growing up like, oh, he or she's going to be a lawyer, a doctor, Wall Street, or whatever big fancy supposedly job title that they would be proud to be able to tell their friends, my son's a lawyer or doctor, right? Coaching, no matter what sport, especially at the beginning level, as you're typically struggling, whether it's finding a job that pays well, finding roots, etc., is usually a pretty tough aspect for that person. But for the parent, can sometimes think like, well, what they're just still trying to figure themselves out before they go to law school or whatever. As you were starting to cement yourself as, okay, I'm a college track coach. It was just a fairly small job back then, meaning like not a lot of people had that job. Right. What did your parents think? I just think about, your mom raising, what you said, 4 kids total, dad, obviously a high level military. What did your parents think when you're like, yeah, guys, I'm a track coach?
Well, I think that, I think they kind of viewed it as a continuation of teaching. Like, so in high school, I taught history and government, civics, those types of courses. And I think they just kind of thought that I was just continuing to do that. I'm just doing it at a collegiate level as opposed to a high school level. I really don't think they realized that I was just a track coach, just that's all I did. As I said, neither one of them had any background in sport and really didn't have much interest in sport. Right. And so they didn't really understand, that at all. And they didn't understand my, my draw to it or whatever, but they were always supportive. So.
Yeah, good. Yeah, mom's telling her friends, oh yeah, my son Cliff, he's a professor at KU, yeah. And you're like, yeah, professor of track, maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
That's about as far as we could go there. So keep us going. You're on the women's side there. You're coaching. You're still, coaching education is starting to become, and I want to say it becomes integral to you in your career, but it's becoming a thing for you. How does that work out, and what are you envisioning? Is this or at this time and point, are you thinking like, well, I want to be a head coach of Kansas or Florida or wherever you might have thought at that point?
Yeah, no, I truly never had any desire to become a head coach at early on. I thought that if I could work with good people at a good institution, that was plenty. And I never ever envisioned being a head coach. And the truth of the matter, so Steve Miller, when he left Cal Poly and came to Kansas State, and he was the head coach here for 5 or 6 years, I believe. And so when he first came to Kansas State, he had an enormous amount of success at both the high school level at Bloom in Chicago, and then at Cal Poly, won a number of national championships there at the Division II level. And so when he came to Kansas State, and he brought a lot of his former coaches and athletes with him, Greg Kraft and John Capriotti, Manny Batista, right. Randy Cole, Daryl Anderson, that was the crew that he brought with him. And and I just got to know those guys really well. Um, and, uh, um, and so when Steve Miller started to make the transition into administration, he eventually became the athletic director at Kansas State. Um, he had offered, well, first it started off, he says, hey, I'm going to be moving into administration. Um, Greg Kraft had just left, I think, to go to, I believe it was Virginia at the time. And so he was going to hire, a field events coach. And he asked me to interview. And, but the uniqueness of it is that you were going to come in that initial year, work with him as an assistant, and then you would become the head coach the following year.
Oh,
I was 32, 33 years old at the time. And I'm like, Coach, I'm not ready to be a head coach at a Division I school. I don't have your kind of background and experience and so forth. I'm not ready. And he said, well, I kind of know who we want to hire. I just think that you should come in and go through the interview process and so forth. And so I did. And it was a great learning experience. It's really the only interview I've ever had.
I was going to say kind of the first and maybe only interview. Right? That's
that
what I
was
was
probably
thinking.
the only one I ever had. Yeah. And I went into it knowing that I wasn't going to get hired.
And you didn't want it. You're like, I'm not. Right. Very unique.
But anyway, and that's where I really saw the difference. And please don't misunderstand. I'm not saying better. I'm just saying the difference between the environments at the University of Kansas and Kansas State. And it was, Kansas State's, has a big ag influence and so forth. And it was, land grant college, and, it's just a different feel. And I really, really was impressed with just how people friendly a place it was. And but anyway, so went through that process, and a week or so later, I get a call from Coach Miller, and he says, Cliff would like you to take the job.
You're like, wait a minute, I thought we talked about this.
I said, Coach, you were going to hire, so and so, and yeah, it didn't work out, and you need to take the job. I said, Coach, I'm not ready. And well, at the same time, Coach Timmons is announced that he's retiring. And the athletic director, who was Bob Frederick at the time, made the decision they were going to combine the programs. And so Carla had left and moved on to, I believe it was Smith College at the time. She was spent a lot of years there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so Bob Frederick said, if you stay, we'll make you the interim women's coach for a year. You're not going to get the job here. But, he kind of tugged on my, heartstrings of being a KU alum.
Sure, yeah.
And so anyway, I made a decision to stay there. And because I knew that I just wasn't ready to be a head coach. And so Coach Miller wasn't too happy with me at the time, but and he's still kind of kid about it today. But anyway, so John, they hired John Capriotti. He had left and spent a year or two at Northwestern coaching cross country on the gal side there.
Northwestern up in Chicago?
Chicago, yeah.
I did not know that. Oh, okay. Yeah. Wow.
So he had coached John in high school and coached him at Cal Poly. And so when he hired John, John was a GA at K-State the same time I was a GA at KU, and we had got to know each other and recruiting and all that other stuff. And so when he was hired, then he offered me a position, and I'm like, okay, this is a different deal. And so I went there, and Gary Schwartz had come in at the time as the head coach at KU, the combined program. And, there really wasn't a spot for me anyway. So that's how I ended up at Kansas State.
When you go to Kansas State and, you had the opportunity to be the women's interim head coach at KU, the initial offer at K-State was to come in, be the assistant, and then take over the head. Now that you're at K-State as an assistant, are you thinking differently about becoming a head coach? Because, now there had been some opportunities in front of you. It seemed like maybe this was your path, at least very early in the career. And if so, what did you do? Because there's a lot of assistant coaches out there right now that either believe they want to be a coach or think they want to be a head coach. And there's some whole stipulations about what's different from being a head coach than being an assistant coach, and not positively all necessarily, by the way. So did you start preparing yourself to become a head coach here in the next, there was no timeline at that point, but, in the near future? And if you did, what were some of the things that you did to prepare yourself?
I think that's a great question. And I think it's a lesson that a lot of us in the profession of coaching maybe don't have the right mentoring earlier on, and so we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, so no, even when I came to Kansas State, I had no desire to be a head coach. Zero. I wanted to just, I was hired at that time to come in and coach the jumps and combined events, and I was excited about that, and that's all I wanted to do. And now, having said that, one thing that was impressed upon me, again, Coach Timmons, Coach Pepin, those were my two instructors when I took the coaching of track and field class at the University of Kansas.
Wow.
Two Hall of Fame coaches. And I was just around a lot of folks that had complete, if you will, backgrounds, in their resume. So, Roger Bowen had coached at the community college level, so he had to coach everything. Stan had coached a lot of different things. Coach Pepin had coached at the high school level for a number of years before coming to KU as an assistant. He coached a lot of things. Coach Timmons was coaching distance runners and throwers, when he was at KU. And so, the idea of, being a specialist was not anything that I ever heard about when I started in coaching. It was just the opposite. It was like, you want to learn as much as you can about everything, and that will make you a better coach at whatever it is you're doing. I've always felt like the years I spent coaching distances helped me as a sprint hurdle coach. It helped me as a combined event coach. So I personally think that we should be striving to have a really keen understanding of everything. The other thing that I had heard early on, and I don't even remember who told me this, but somewhere along the way, it was told to me that if you're going to be a successful head coach, then you need to have a very good understanding of all the events and the issues that coaches that deal with those events have to deal with. Because how else are you going to be able to hire, evaluate coaches? How else are you going to be able to understand what's going on in these other areas if you don't have any understanding of it at all? And that always resonated with me. And so I've always encouraged, young coaches or athletes transitioning from going into coaching to learn as much as they can about the other areas. We had a gal, Renetta Seiler, who was a very fine thrower for us at Kansas State, did everything, shot, disc, hammer, jab. She decided she wanted to go into coaching. And when she asked about helping us out in a, kind of a volunteer role, her first year out. I just assumed that she wanted to work in the throws area. And she said, "No, coach, no, I don't want to do that. I've done that. I have an understanding of that. I want to be a track coach. I want to follow you in the jumps and combined events and sprints and hurdles and stuff."
Wow.
And she coached national champions in long jump and so forth at Division II level. So and she had great success in the throws at the Division I level, but she coached, very, very successful athletes in event areas that no one ever envisioned her coaching.
I like that. I like that advice, and you put a different spin into it. I always advise young coaches, typically young sprints coaches will hang out with other sprint coaches. And that's great. There's a lot of commonalities there. But I mentioned to coaches who ever have a dream of becoming a head coach, it's like, well, if you want to get hired somewhere, it's typically not going to be the same. Head coach is not going to be your another sprint coach isn't going to typically hire another sprint coach. They need a distance coach and a throws coach, et cetera. So you better know other people. I like your side of it of like, well, hey, if you're going to be a head coach, well, how in the world can you evaluate your distance coach and your shot put candidates and things like that, your throws candidates, if you don't have even an understanding of it? Is it just blind trust? Like, okay, well, they did well, I guess you go do your thing over there and we'll meet up at the track meet, I guess. I love that advice of like, even if you're not going to be a coach of a lot of different events, at least have some understanding of their common complaints, concerns, issues, positives, also the positive sides of that. That's really good advice out there to be really that complete track and field coach, not that specialized, quote unquote, specialized coach.
Right. Yeah. It's, for example, when I first became the head coach at Kansas State, the first thing I did, within 48 hours of being named a position, is went to the administration and said, we've got to move our discus rings. They're in the exact opposite corners of this. I don't know why it was done that way, but they're not where they should be. And, we didn't have cages and at that time. And it was literally the first thing I said is we got to get this changed. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I think that it's just very difficult, I think, to manage a program if you just don't understand the unique needs, concerns, mm-hmm. issues of the different event areas and the coaches. I just think it would be almost impossible to do.
Well, we've got a lot to explore on that topic because you have a passion for it and I have a passion for it. Let's keep moving forward in your journey. You just mentioned when you became one of the first things you did when you became the head coach at Kansas State. So how did that evolve? You're the assistant coach working with combined athletes. How does that career continue to move forward to where either you finally relented and decided you did want to become a head coach, or you were just forced into it and someone made you the head coach?
Well, so John Capriati, who was the head coach and worked, with him for basically 3.5 years. So in November of 92, he left to go work for Nike. And that was when they named me first interim, and then, a few months later, whatever it was, the head coach going forward. So it wasn't anything I applied for. Mm-hmm. It wasn't anything I pursued. I was just here and it was I was just, I guess literally in the right place at the right time and just had that opportunity. I mentioned earlier that, after 1 year as a grad assistant at KU, I was being offered positions at some really fine programs. There was no way I was ready for that. But because I was at KU, which was such a powerhouse, if you will, program at the time, and was working, around coaches that everyone had such respect for, they're like, well, we'll give this young guy a shot or whatever. But I knew I wasn't ready. And every year I'm being offered jobs that I know I'm not ready for. And I was not going to put myself in a position unless I knew I was going to be able to succeed. I just wasn't going to do that. Maybe part of it is that military background. What's kind of famous about the military is that, is the Peter principle. You rise to your level of incompetence.
Yep.
and I didn't want to be a victim of that. And so I probably could have had jobs throughout my career much sooner. But I knew I wasn't ready, and I wasn't going to put myself in a position to fail when I knew that I wasn't prepared, as well as I should be at that point in time. So,
well, Cliff,
and I know that's a difficult thing to advise somebody to do. But I do think people have to be, self-aware enough to look and, am I really ready for this? Or would another year, benefit me? And so I think that was one of the few smart things I've probably done in my life is I didn't put myself in a position that I knew I shouldn't be in.
Well, that begets the question. You mentioned self-awareness, which is a key, but also very hard, especially in the moment. And maybe at that point in time, these different point in times that you're describing, you might not have been able to verbalize why I'm not ready. I'm not going to put myself in this position. But maybe now, after a few decades of coaching and coaching a lot of young people throughout their careers, someone out there right now is asking this question, so that's why I have to ask it. So how do you know when you're ready? So if you said, I know I wasn't ready, I'm not going to put myself in that position, how do you know when you're ready to take whatever the next quote unquote big job is? Or how do you know when you're ready to be the head coach? And maybe an add-on question to that is, do you always have to know that you're ready? Is there sometimes a little bit of putting the cart before the horse and catching up to it in different positions?
Yeah. How do we ever know, okay, truly, am I ready? But I think that, again, as far as, being a track coach is concerned, if you may have worked with or shadowed a coach, but, have you actually written training? Have you actually been involved in recruiting? One of the things that a grad assistant at the University of Kansas back at that time, working for Bob Timmons and Gary Pepin, you're going to recruit. You learned how to recruit, and you learned to work hard at recruiting. So I wasn't worried about that part of it, because I'd been shown by the best how to do that. But I hadn't had those opportunities of writing program at that point in time for larger groups or whatever. Maybe, I was kind of working at the time with, 400 hurdlers and a lot with the pole vault, but there was a lot of other stuff that I didn't work as much with. And so I just knew that I needed to have more experience and have more exposure to other things before I would, was going to feel real comfortable. And maybe that's part of it too. I think maybe some people they can be comfortable being a little bit uncomfortable. And at that point in time, I guess maybe I just wasn't one of those folks. I had to feel more comfortable.
Well, I think the key to that right there, to what you just said there, is that self-awareness. Because I think you're spot on. There are people that are better at and need to be a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit just ahead of the curve and catching up to things. And there's other people that don't. They need to be brought along. Neither are incorrect. The incorrect is when the person who thinks they need to be comfortable doesn't take the leap, or vice versa. So that self-awareness, I think, is key. I think that might be maybe your superpower through your career, is that self-awareness of, okay, I believe I need to be here, and I think I need to do this. I need to make sure I'm not focusing on just one event group, etc. We touched on it a little bit earlier about the difference between a head coach and an assistant coach. And I mentioned that, there's some assistant coaches that think they want to be head coaches, and they really don't, because of the different responsibilities that a head coach has to occur for naturally just being in that quote unquote big chair. as you became the head coach of Kansas State, what surprised you the most? Was there an aspect of the new job, the head coaching job, that you were like, man, I did not see that coming. I didn't know I had to be responsible for X, Y, and Z. Or did you get brought along with some of these amazing mentors you had in your life? Did they bring you in on those things as an assistant coach? I'm thinking of things like you already mentioned, like recruiting and writing workouts and things like that. I'm thinking of, ordering equipment, scheduling, travel, alumni, fundraising, things like that. What surprised you the most, or did you get brought up in the right speed and maybe it was just you just had a different title now at this point?
Yeah, well, the good thing for me, I think, I kind of felt like I was ready to manage the task. Like I said, I didn't have any strong desire to be the head coach, but I felt like I was ready because I'd already worked in every single event area at one time or another at that point in time. I'd already been heavily involved in recruiting, heavily involved in meet administration. When I was a GA, I was, running off, marathons and cross country races and track meets. I worked with the Lawrence at that time, the Lawrence Track Club. We had 250 kids in the spring program. And so I had done all of those kinds of things. I'd been exposed to every aspect of the sport and of running a program. So I wasn't caught by surprise by anything at that point in time, which is, and part of the reason for that is Coach Timmons had a philosophy of changing responsibilities of most certainly the GAs, but even the full-time assistants from year to year, because he wanted them, one, not to get stale, but two, to have an opportunity to be exposed to every aspect of the program. And I think that maybe it was he that kind of said that to me, that you got to be aware of, even to be a good assistant, you've got to be aware of everything. Certainly as a head coach, you got to be aware of everything. And the only way you're going to gain that awareness is by doing it. and so with the GAs, for example, at that time, and when I was there, you didn't have the limits and things like you do today. We had 7 GAs. And those 7 GAs, every single one of them eventually went on to become a head cross country coach or a head track and field coach at a Division I level. Al Schmidt, was longtime head coach at Florida State, was one of the GAs at KU at the time.
I did not know that. Big Daddy Al's like my dad. I mean, come on, I love Al. I did not know he was one of the GAs there. Oh,
yeah,
that's awesome.
And so I mean, not just their full-time staff, but when you look at the people that were GAs there at the time, it's pretty amazing.
Wow.
And so I think that's having that background and him rotating GAs from event group to event group. I didn't really get that opportunity, but most of the guys, they spent time with different coaches in different event areas. So my second year as a GA, Coach Timmons made the decision that I was going to be the sprint hurdle coach. And because he wanted the full-time coach, Roger Bowen at the time, to concentrate on recruiting, and he could continue to do vault and all that. But he really wanted him to focus on recruiting. And so he just made that decision. So, I mean, that was a great opportunity for me to because I was forced now to do program design for all of those athletes. And I had never done that before with sprinters and hurdlers. So anyway, I think, because I was exposed to, how he did things, and that resonated with me. I always was willing to take on whatever, responsibilities needed to be done. just knowing that eventually this is going to help me just become a better coach, whether I become a head coach or not.
Right.
I think the best staffs are where you have a lot of people, whether they have the desire to be head coach or not, they do have a desire to learn everything they can learn about running a program. Those are the best staffs out there. I think I happened to be at KU at the time when Larry Brown was coaching there, and there was a staff that's just unbelievable, and they were very, very successful at this time, but when you hear the names that were on this staff, you right away understand, okay, that's why they were what they were. So John Calipari was a grad assistant there at the time.
Pretty good.
Coach Brown says, I want you to go sit down and talk to Cliff about, plyometric training, and, so we wrote programs for, the basketball team.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Bob Hill was the top assistant at the time, who coached many years in the NBA after that. Alvin Gentry was on that staff. Popovich was on that staff. R.C. Buford, who's the GM at San Antonio, was on that staff. Bill Self was on that staff. I mean,
wow.
Has there ever been a staff more accomplished, in any sport, at the same time? It was phenomenal.
Wow.
But as I said, John Calipari was a GA at that time. And so all those guys were at different stages of their career. But almost all those guys are in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, right. Or soon to be.
Or will be.
Yeah.
And it was just a phenomenal staff, but they were at different stages and they were all being exposed to doing different things. And obviously it paid off for them. So I just think that, that willingness, I think one of the worst things we can do to ourselves is, this is just my opinion, is to become a specialist.
When we started the podcast back in January of 20, the initial goal was to uplift and honor coaches around the world and specifically here in the US. As we moved along, in year 1 and year 2, it became, from feedback, pretty evident of the other value that you're bringing to listeners. So with that in mind, I want to go on this topic that's exactly what you were just talking about there, about coaches and development and professional development into future head coaches. One of my favorite questions to ask guests when we go through the journey and they become a head coach, if that's part of their journey, my favorite question is always to ask, and I asked it a little bit different for you, but I always ask, were you prepared? And the real self-aware ones always say, yeah, no, I was not. I had no idea X, Y, and Z had to occur as well. And as I delve into, again, when you interview 200 coaches, you learn a lot of things and use my own experience of 10 years of coaching as well. It doesn't feel like, and this is a generalization, I realize even a sample group of 200 is small, it doesn't feel like we as a coaching body are doing a good job of developing assistant coaches into future head coaches, that we don't share some of the responsibilities. I love what you talked about there with KU of like, oh yeah, we rotated, 1 year you were in charge of this, maybe the next year you were in charge of that, or you shadowed this person for what they could focus on. I don't see a majority of that going on. I see more of that specialization of, hey, you're my throws coach, go recruit and coach the throws. I, as the head coach, I'm going to do all the scheduling, all the budgeting. I'm not even going to bring you in. And I don't know if that's if it's an ego thing in regards to like, no, I want to keep control. The bad ego is not bad. Bad ego is bad. So is it an ego of control? I want to keep control over all of these aspects. Or is it a time thing? I mean, what you do today in 2023 as a head coach, you agree or disagree here, is different than what you did in 1995 or what year you did as a head coach in regards to just all the other things that are going on with the world, cell phones, social media, NIL, the whole shebang, rules changing every year that you're keeping up and making sure everybody's in compliance, things like that. you seem to, and I know a lot of your former assistants who have gone on to be either assistant coaches at other places or head coaches in other places. And I've talked to several of those guys and gals through my life, and they always seem like the ones that were more prepared. And they talk about like, yeah, I was, at K-State, I was able to do this part, not just focus on my event area and my event recruiting. Talk to us about that importance. Like, there's other head coaches that are listening right now, maybe we can make some change here. Talk about the importance of delegation, and maybe it's more intentionality of professional development of your assistant coaching staff, that they one day can either become the head coach at your institution. One day you're going to be gone, or another institution. Talk to us about that intentionality and the importance of that for the profession of coaching as large.
Yeah, I think it's important to, and I tell our staff, that repeating myself, but the best staffs are staffs made up of assistants who want to arm themselves with all the skills they need to ultimately become a successful head coach. So you need to be knowledgeable about more than just the events that you're most passionate about.
Right.
You need to be familiar with ordering equipment and shoes and those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
You may be at one institution where you don't have to do that, but you may be a head coach at an institution where you're going to have to do that. Mm-hmm. And meet administration, putting on meets. I mean, there's obviously we have some really wonderful facilities in our country, and we're getting more of them. But for many years, there weren't as many facilities,
right.
And there were a lot of people that weren't putting on track meets and have no idea what it is to put on a track meet. And I will say that I think a lot of times those people are not very appreciative of those people who do put on track meets, and understanding of what they're going through to put on this meet, so that you have an opportunity, right, to compete there. But so again, it's kind of hard for you to appreciate the work that they're putting on to put on this meet when you've never put on a track meet.
Yeah, good point.
And so I think that what we try to do, not necessarily every year, but certainly with people that have been with us we've had a lot of assistants that have been here for a long time, is kind of rotate responsibilities, get them exposed to doing different things. And I've always been, encouraging of them, going and spending some time at the throws ring and watching Coach Watson work, mm-hmm, and so forth. I mean, we have some really fine coaches here now, and people that have, have had lots of success and lots of experience. And, you're just a fool if you don't go over and spend some time just talking shop with Randy Cole, mm-hmm, who's coached at every level and has been successful everywhere.
Successful. Yeah. Right.
So anyway, I that's something that we've always encouraged and try to foster as best we can. And I think it would benefit everyone's program if they did that. In talking to high school coaches, about working with athletes, for example, not only is the athlete going to benefit from not specializing, but your team is going to benefit from them not specializing. Mm. I believe that strongly. And so, I think you got to drink out of different fountains.
Well, what do you say to the person that says, okay, there are, 20 events, and I can either try to learn all of them, and some are going to be a little deeper than others, of course, or I can narrow down into one or two specialties and I can get really deep. So Cliff, that's great that you can coach the 1500, the decathlon, just as good as you can coach the javelin, as good as you can coach the hurdles and the 100. But my sprinters are going to beat you because I know everything air quotes there on everything, but I know much more about how to develop sprinters. What do you say to the person that says, this is why I'm a specialist, because I can get deeper in that area?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that, but what I would say, though, the caveat being that, yes, but you're also going to become a better sprint coach if you have a better understanding of some of these other disciplines, right? So, maybe your ideas with respect to multiple jump training could be enhanced if you were sharing with the person working with the jumps, or what you do in the weight room could be enhanced if you were spending time with that person who, which in many programs typically tends to be throws coaches that maybe have a little bit deeper understanding of the weight room, right? And so but certainly all I can tell you this, and over the years, I've had an opportunity to work with a lot of athletes that have, competed in world championships, Olympic games like that. I've had opportunities to be on a lot of staffs and that kind of thing. And I've roomed with people like George Williams and Clyde Hart and I mean, just on and on. Lauren Seagrave, Dan Paff, Boo Schnecksnader, spent a couple weeks with Dennis Shaver, clear back in 1993 at the World Championships in Stuttgart. We're bouncing around from room to room, just finding a bed, and some of the clinics that broke out were absolutely phenomenal.
Right.
Remember, we spent almost 2 weeks in a hotel room with Coach Hart, very late in his career, World Championships in London, and he said every day let's talk about an event. And so literally, it might start in the afternoon or whatever, and it just go through the evening, and it could be over a cup of coffee or tea or whatever, or it could be over a beer or a glass of wine, but they went well into the early morning hours. And one of the things that I tell people this, because this is what, I think what you're asking is, so here's a guy at the end of his career who's had phenomenal success in, not only from a team perspective, but individually and so forth with his athletes. And he said, Cliff, tomorrow I want to talk about high jump. And I said, just the high jump? He says, yeah, I want to talk about the high jump. He says, I want to hear everything you know about the high jump. And so we literally talked about the high jump for 8 hours. And here's a guy who's 70 plus years old at the end of his career, who's not coaching that event. Right. But he just wanted to learn everything he could learn about the high jump.
Wow.
But I've had the same kinds of conversations with Harvey Glantz, with George Williams, with, you know what I mean? People who've been doing this for a long time at a very high level. And they want to talk about things that are outside of their comfort zone and outside of what they do, because they want to learn. And so again, that specialist, that's fine, that's good, but don't tell me you can't learn from other people that do different things in other disciplines, because if you believe that, then that's not good.
And as someone who's seen a lot of different athletes, so, you throughout your career have gotten athletes that are quote unquote ready-made, meaning they're, very high level when they get to you, all the way down to walk-on kids that, not a development needs to happen. Would you agree, disagree, expound on that most athletes, and I'm talking about, well, let's use the 80-20% rule. 80% of athletes actually would get better in their events if they got really good at the basics, versus we tend to try to find that 1%, that the quote unquote magic pill, that one workout, that one technique that we can get better at, when in reality they would get much better if they were better at bounding, or better at their general, or better at their max speed for a sprint, or things like that.
No question. Just a couple of days ago, I think, Altus and Dan, he sends out newsletters or whatever. And I didn't even read it. But I just saw the title. It was specialize in generalization.
Right.
And right away I was just like, my ears kind of perked up, because I really think that absolutely that's where it's at. And I think that particularly in this day and age with kids and what their backgrounds are, one, because they are specializing earlier, two, because they don't have the same kind of childhood doing the kinds of things that we did when we were younger. I think there's a different, some people, they may have a great nervous system, whatever, but if their capacity to handle work is not great, then there's only so far they can go.
Right.
And I just think, I'm working with a guy right now, TJ Shankar, who is a really fine high jumper, won a couple NCAA championships in the high jump. And he got really excited about doing combined events just a couple of years ago. He did he scored 75, 80 or whatever, the first decathlon of his life last year at the conference meet. And this last weekend, he ran 47.5, and he's high jumping the best he's ever jumped in his life right now.
Wow.
And so here's a guy who's, post-collegiate athlete, who's working a full-time job at a public accounting firm. Wow. And he's still getting better in his specialty, and he's doing everything. And I know you don't want to get into X's and O's, but it's just been my experience with the athletes I've worked with. The most successful athletes I've worked with in any event that you want to say have been people who had, part of the reason they got good is because they had long careers. And part of the reason they had long careers is because they stayed healthy.
Yeah, we forget about that part. Yeah.
And so I think it's critical.
I love it.
Whether we're a coach or we're an athlete, I think it's critical.
Or as a person.
Or as
right.
a person.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. So I got a lot of other topics I want to get into, but I just realized we kind of got up to head coach of Kansas State and then started going to these other topics. I don't want to dismiss the time frame from becoming the head coach at K-State today. Tell me how long you've been at Kansas State now?
This is my 35th year.
35th year. Not a lot of us can say we've been at the same job, whether we're talking about coaches or not, but maybe specifically coaches, 30 plus years. And by the way, guilty. I coached for 10 and I was at 5 different places. So this is not me chastising. This is just, it was my reality at that point. What have you seen change, over 35 years at Kansas State? And obviously, we talked about some of the social changes that have happened with cell phones, social media, things like that. But how have you seen Kansas State grow in those 35 years, maybe specifically track and field, but maybe as athletics?
Well, we're amidst probably one of the more successful years that a athletic department has ever had right now. with the football team winning the Big 12 and playing in a major bowl game, and then the basketball team just getting to the Elite Eight, and they were picked to be last in the conference this year in basketball.
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, wow.
Yeah. So certainly the two high profile sports, if you will, are at an extremely high level right now. And we all benefit from that, clearly. But I think, facilities at this university, what things look like today compared to 1988, in the fall of 88 was my first year here, it's even further than night and day. It's hard to believe. We're going to Ahern Fieldhouse, which has been there, was built in 52.
Classic.
Is hosted, many junior college national championships, and actually the only Big 12 championship that was ever held on a flat 200 track was in Ahern. But it's closing down. We're literally about 20 days away from never being able to go in there again, at least from an athletic perspective. But the good thing, that's kind of sad for a guy like me.
Yeah, sure.
But the good thing is that we built a new indoor football facility.
Mm-hmm.
And so the old one, which sits just to the east of our outdoor track, is going to be converted, and we're going to put a 200-meter bank track in there.
Awesome.
Yeah, so we'll hopefully move into there, all things going well, next December.
Yeah.
So from a facility standpoint, it's amazing, where we are now. We just built, they're just in the finishing stages of a new volleyball facility and Olympic sport building. So our Olympic sports are going to, for the first time, have their own weight room and their own training room. It's amazing. The basketball facilities, the football facilities, baseball, soccer, rowing, everybody. It's amazing. And so that's probably been the biggest change I've seen. One of our former athletes who was from Hungary, Attila Shavatsky, was inducted in our Athletic Hall of Fame and wasn't able to make it back to the ceremony due to COVID. And so we were able to get him and his wife back to be recognized at a basketball game a month or so ago. And he was here in late 90s, and he was, this isn't the same place. It was just like he couldn't believe the changes here, just in general at the university, but certainly from a facility standpoint, athletically, it's just amazing. And then the size of our athletic department. We're probably there's two things: one, the size, and two, the age, average age. I'm the oldest person in our department, I'm pretty sure, and I'd say the average age of our department is probably early 30s right now. And when I came here, it was probably late 40s.
Interesting.
So it's significantly younger.
Yeah.
And probably in terms of employees of the athletic department, it's probably 6-7 times larger than when I came here.
Oh, wow.
In 88. It's amazing.
I love it. We believe healthy things grow. So it's awesome to see facilities growing, coaches growing, athletic departments growing. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Cliff, I have like a list of like 4 to 5 different topics. You okay if we just go?
Absolutely.
Like there's no order now. We've gone from, you as a elementary school kid up to today. Now we have no order on things. So these are just things that, knowing you as well as I do know, think that you would have a unique perspective on. So I'm just going to kind of say the topic, and I just want you to kind of give your thoughts and ideas, and we'll riff on it here a little bit. So the first one is women's decathlon. What are we doing? Are we going to do this? Should it happen? I know I believe you've been a proponent. I know you've had some people, Kluft, I think is my first name. I think that might be the wrong name, that started doing the decathlon, but talk to us about women's decathlon.
Yes. I'm a big proponent of it. When as the IAAF, a number of years ago, it voted to switch over to the women's decathlon. And there was a timeline in place in which it'd be at the world junior level here, it'd be at the world championships here, it'd be the Olympic Games here, and then that vote was rescinded, and and I can speak to exactly why it was rescinded. It was because of one, a couple of meets in Europe, large combined event meets that they felt like those meet directors felt like it would detract, and or their facility couldn't handle it. Both of which I think they were mistaken. And you mentioned one of the athletes, Carolina Cliff and Eunice Barber, were the two big names, if you will, in the heptathlon at that time. Eunice actually was transitioning to just doing individual events, but was probably still being paid as though she was going to continue to do the heptathlon. She had no interest in doing that. And Carolina did not have interest in doing it.
Yeah, see, Carolina is not the name I was thinking of. Who was the athlete you had that was a really good heptathlete, and she did some decathlons?
Ostrascuta.
That's who I was thinking of. That to me is, for me, is one of like the pioneers of like going on and trying the actual decathlon. Yeah, that's who I was, not Kluft. Yeah.
And so anyway, they all lobbied against it. And so they, rescinded that vote. And I think it was a big mistake, personally. I think that, obviously there are different measures. Initially, when the women's decathlon was approved, they flipped the middle events of the first day and second day. And so when Austria, she still has the world record in the women's decathlon. When she set the world record, she jumped 183 in the high jump, and that was the 9th event. So it's a little bit different.
Yeah.
Obviously. Right. So, I don't think that was, and so more recently, when women's decathlons have been contested, they've been doing the men's order. But in the beginning they said, no, you need to flip or whatever. And so anyway, that's when she set the record, that's, what it was. But I think it would be a great event. I think that, when we look historically, when we talked about the women's hammer, there were a lot of folks that like, no, we don't want to do this. And now look at it. When we talked about the women's pole vault, oh, they can't do it, it won't be any good. Now look at it. When you look at the steeplechase, I remember the first USA championship, girls were stopping and climbing over the barriers, right? And swimming through the water pit. But now look at it. And, so I think it's silly to say that they can't do it. I understand that there's always going to be some athletes that have trained for a significant period of time, and they're at the top of the high school level, top of the collegiate level, top of the world level, and they don't want to see it change. But we're always going to have that. And, at some point you just got to make the change. And if you stair step it in, then you're going to have, when it gets to the world championship level or Olympic level, I promise you, you're going to have a hell of an event. And so I would personally like to see it happen. And I think it should happen. I think it would be a better test. And I think to say that the gals can't do it is just ridiculous.
Yeah. You mentioned those 3 events, the hammer, the steeple, and the pole vault. For those individuals who have just gotten into track in the last 5 or 10 years, or those who have just gotten into coaching track and field, those are just normal events. We just have them. It was not that long ago. In fact, was it 96 or 2000 was the first pole vault?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's
right after 96. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
That was,
I think it was exhibition maybe in 96 or whatever.
Yeah. That was
right in that time frame.
That was yesterday. What? I mean, this is current history of those events that women weren't allowed, weren't good enough. It was going to be detriment to their health. It's not that long ago. You go back and we didn't allow women to run over 800 meters because they would just die, is what the prevailing thought was, which again, now we look back at it, to your point about, look at what the women's pole vault and the women's hammer and the women's steeplechase is doing today. And it's like, what were we doing? Man, why didn't we start this 20 years before that? Look how good would they be today? So it feels like the women's decathlon is, maybe in 10, 15 years, hopefully sooner than that, we'll be talking like, why did we fight this? What were we doing in 2020 that we couldn't have just gone ahead and made this decision to move forward and let them compete in the exact same event that we allow the men to compete? So it feels like it's one of those things. It's just, when is it going to happen?
Right. Yeah, I hope soon. I hope it's in my lifetime that I have an opportunity to watch them do it, because I think it's a great test, and I think the women would do just fine.
So the next topic, and I don't know that I've ever actually heard you speak on this, but to me, it's kind of in that same vein. Women's high hurdles, and this topic comes up every few years and kind of becomes hot. And in the last year or two, it's started to make its rounds because of how fast the women's 100 hurdles have become collegially and professionally. Should we move those to 36 inches?
I certainly wouldn't be opposed to it. I think, yeah, when you look at just how fast they're running, and the hurdle folks know that, a lot of women don't really have to hurdle. They're just sprinting and they're just stepping over more, and it's, it's great. It's wonderful. And because of the, assuming that we're not going to change, distance between hurdles and that kind of thing. I mean, it is what it is. Everybody has to adapt to those parameters, but I think I would like to see it raised. Yes, I think it would be a truer test.
I've been a proponent for a while, and I still remember back in '98 when I was coaching at Troy, and I wanted to help bring data more to it. So I would have our high hurdlers, who certainly they were not K-State caliber high hurdlers, okay, but we knew what their PRs were and what their split times were, and we would also have them do it over 36 to start collecting data. But I did hear, and I think this was Charles Ryan over at San Jose State now. I think he's the one that said it. So I may be attributing to the wrong person, but I think the ones he said that kind of made me pause and think about I think it should move to 36. And he was like, why does it have to be the same event? It doesn't have to be the same event. When we talk about the same event, meaning like how much the center of mass raises, for the men versus women. And it's like, why does it have to be the same? It's like, well, that's a good point too. Why can't it just be its own event? That's what we do on the women's side. So I'm kind of torn now, but I was, like I said, I was interested in hearing your side of it. I thought you'd be a proponent of it.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that sentiment either. I mean, I can live with that too, but it's like the weight of the implements for the gals. I mean, why are the gals at the world class level throwing the same weight as
I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a good topic too. The high school to college transition and move on. Yeah, for women's implements.
I think I don't know. I think that again, I think it's the gals can't handle it, but that's silly. And so I don't know.
That's what it certainly feels like to me too.
Things can evolve, and it's okay.
That's what it feels like to me too. It's the males who have run the sport for quote unquote forever, that the women just can't do it. That's what it feels like. That's the sentiment. It's like, no, we can't challenge them. They'll shirk away. It won't be as good. And it's like, man, guess what? They're human like we are. They'll adapt. They'll figure out that heavier discus or the higher hurdles. They'll figure it out. And look, again, we have history. Look what they have figured out. Really high level stuff here. So,
well, you have gals dunking now in games, right? And,
right.
That was unheard of.
Yeah.
Certainly 20 years ago it was unheard of, but now it's a lot of gals, just different.
Exactly right. Okay, next topic as we start wrapping up here. So you are obviously really big on staff development, so not just hiring a plug and play coach on your staff. Like there's still, you're going to develop, if you're part of a Rovelto staff, as a complete coach in some form or fashion. My understanding is there's a new rule coming this summer and now instead of 6 full-time coaches, we can go to a max of 12. How do you foresee, you don't necessarily have to speak on what Kansas State's is going to do. But what do you see this as a good thing of development of track and field coaches, or is this a watering down and they should just be GAs first? What do you think about this new rule of more full-time coaches for track?
Well, I think the idea of providing more opportunity is wonderful. I don't know that that's the motivation for doing what we're doing. I think it is, but the idea that we're providing more opportunity is great. Like I said, when it was at KU, it was 7 GAs, and that was just the men's program. That was just 3 full-time coaches. You had 7 GAs just on the men's side.
Oh,
yes, yeah, and so that gave Al Schmidt. Al Schmidt left a head job to come be a GA at KU. And so I think what more needs to be said?
right.
Having those opportunities is a valuable thing. So whether we're allowing more GA positions or whatever, I think that's good, because I think we're exposing people. Like I said, there's no way I would be sitting here today talking to you if it wasn't for the time I spent with Coach Timmons and Coach Pepin and Stan Naruski and so forth when I was at the University of Kansas. There's no way. It's just that simple. And I got that opportunity because of a grad assistant position. And so I think providing more opportunities is a good thing. How it's going to be managed and the fact that it's coming about the way it's coming about, wish it were different, but I think providing those opportunities will be wonderful.
Yeah.
And hopefully people will use these opportunities to grow these staff people, and not just have them be full-time recruiters or
Right.
whatever. Hopefully that's what will happen.
Yeah, I agree. More opportunities. I love the idea that someone who wouldn't have a shot to go be an assistant coach on Bob Brayman's staff, now maybe this is an opportunity for them. Like, I think about like learning from people like that, learning from people like you, et cetera. I think that is wonderful, not just for our collegiate track and field, because I believe those people can go and be in that profession as the 10th assistant coach at such and such university for a year or two, and then go back and coach high school at a really high level from all the things they've learned. So I love that. My fear is, I don't think as a body we're paying our coaches, our track coaches specifically, enough. So my fear is that this becomes more $15,000, $20,000 annual salaries, and it's I just think there's a disaster for that, as far as taking care of yourself, your family, your future family, things like that. So that's my only fear of that, is I just hope that there is a commiserate salary increase for our schools that decide to hire the 7th, 8th, 9th, 12th assistant coach.
Yeah, well, and I'm sure some schools will be able to do that, but the problem is there's going to be a lot of schools that won't be able to do that.
Certainly, yeah.
And but still, just having that opportunity is huge. I think there's so many. Again, when you look at a lot of the most successful coaches, a lot of them were not necessarily great athletes. A lot of them, as you mentioned, were had come from the high school level. A lot of them had spent a couple of years as a GA or a volunteer assistant or whatever. That's just how they started, and every single one of them. I've never spoke with anybody. Obviously, we all would have liked to have maybe gotten a little more money during that time frame, but I haven't ever spoken to anyone that didn't think that those years in those positions wasn't a difference maker in their career.
Right.
So
I love it. I love it.
Part of the growth process.
All right, Cliff. First of all, thank you. again, your time. I'm always amazed that, first of all, that anybody gives me the time of day to come onto this podcast. I'm just so humbled for that. When you do it during track season, because I've been there, so I know every minute is booked up. So I'm just so thankful for your time. I am trying to, we're going to do something on the fly here. I want to unveil something for the podcast. We kind of unveiled this a little bit at USTF CCCA. We had a live event there. And through everybody who came in for the live interview on YouTube, anybody that was a Gill podcast alum, I allowed them to flip the script and ask me one question, because I'm the host. I get to just sit here and pepper you with the questions. You got to think about the right answers and how to say them, how to convey your thoughts. So I'm going to convey this. You have no idea that we're doing this. So you're going to have to, I'm going to put you on the spot here. You get to ask either me or the audience, so everybody that listens, one question. So what question would that be? Again, I know I'm putting you on the spot, so I'm going to fill a little air while you think about that. You can either ask me, in my background and my expertise of coaching and here at Gill Athletics as a manufacturer, or you've got thousands of people that listen through all levels. Maybe you have just a general question for them as well. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I think the question I would have for you, but I also would like other folks to think about this is what concerns you about the things that are happening in collegiate athletics today. What are your concerns, and how do you think this will impact our sport going forward?
All right. You heard his question. He asked me and you. So I want you to, I've never caught Cliff on social media, on Twitter. So maybe you tweet to me. Yeah, he's shaking his head. Either he isn't, or he is the most subtweeter ever. I've never just been able to find him. So if you tweet me at Mike Cunningham, I'd love to know your answer to that question. I'm going to answer that question for us as Gill Athletics too, Cliff. That's a really good question. One of our larger concerns about how the landscape is changing with NIL. We're very supportive of athletes. Obviously, we're coach driven, which means we affect athletes. I personally don't have a problem with a kid getting paid, as much money, especially in the Power 5 side, that comes through TV contracts and stuff like that. I have no problem with that. A concern that we do have with NILs is money being funneled. It used to be money would be funneled to the university, and a new track would be built, or a new, we also do basketball and volleyball. Those facilities would be built, and that's great for us as a sports manufacturer. Well, now that alums and fans can now funnel money straight to the athletes, there is a concern. Does there become less money towards the university for facility growth and development? And that would be detrimental to our business if there's less tracks, less fields, outdoor fields, things like that, things that we manufacture for. If those shrink because the money's going straight to, I just saw where LeBron James' kid, who's still in high school, is making $7 million a year through NIL. And on one hand, I bless that. It's like, oh man, that's great. Someone sees value for marketing for you. I love that. Great. Go get that money, kid. Set yourself up, which he probably was already set up because of LeBron, but whatever, set yourself up for the future. That's amazing. But I'm like, oh man, if LeBron would have went to Ohio State, would someone have donated $2 million to Ohio State for a new basketball upgrade instead of to LeBron's kid? And that would help us as a manufacturer. So that's a concern for me and us here at Gill Athletics is, there's only so much money in the world, and obviously there's a lot for sports, but if now I'm gonna call it a big percentage goes straight to athletes, does that hurt facility development, which is pretty vital for us here?
Right.
So that's my answer. Thank you for being on the fly with that, man. I appreciate that. You're even at this age and stage, man, you're quick on your feet. I love that. So I appreciate that. But again, he asked you as well, audience. So if you have an answer, if you're watching on YouTube, put it in the comments below or tweet at me, and I'll make sure he's going to get a report. So if you don't answer, he's not going to get any report. But that's a great question. I appreciate that on the fly there, Cliff. Thank you again so much, man. I'm just so thankful for your time. So humbled you would join us, and I'm just so grateful for your journey, man. I love the role that mentors like a Bob, and then Stan Ruski and all those guys there, man, Gary Pepin, like legends in this sport that poured into you, that have helped create that you are a legend in this sport, in this profession. At least to me, I don't know anybody else, but for me, you're at least a legend, my friend. So I'm just so grateful to hear that journey, and then just the immense value that you bring. And I love that you still have an interest in the law and history side of it. So I know you're quote unquote behind the scenes, helping affect rules changes and the development of track and field as it moves along in the future. We need that. You know, if we don't have a captain help steer the ship, the ship wrecks. So I'm just so thankful you're part of that captainship for our sport. So thank you so much, Cliff.
Well, thank you, Mike. I enjoyed visiting with you, and hopefully this is helpful.
Oh, it is. I bet you. I'll be surprised that we don't get a lot of answers for your questions. Well, okay. Thanks for joining us, Cliff. Thanks for you guys being here. Again, hit me up on social media. Let me know your answer to Cliff's questions. What concerns you about college athletics today and the way that things are changing? What concerns do you have, and how that might affect our sport, specifically our sport of track and field? So join us next week. We'll do it all over again, and appreciate you guys being here. Thanks, everybody.